South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa says political leaders have agreed to work hard to increase Africa's value-added exports to China. Now, he was speaking at the end of a summit in Beijing where $60 billion in additional loans and aid was announced by China for Africa, and with it, a promise of no strings attached. Well, it all sounds great, but critics fear it could lead or load developing nations with too much debt. Stephen McDonald is in Beijing.
The China-Africa summit has wrapped up. So what are we left with as most of the delegations head home? Well, President Xi Jinping says that his country will import more from Africa, especially in terms of products which are not natural resources, that there'll be enhanced cooperation in the transport and energy areas, and that his country will invest more in projects protecting Africa's environment, especially those dealing with climate change. But many analysts will see this as all too general as to be easily quantified in terms of whether or not this will genuinely affect Africa. Sure, the $60 billion in extra aid and loans to Africa is not nothing, but even this has been criticised. It's said that those African countries which can't make the repayments will be locked into China's sphere of influence. And yet, everybody sent representatives, and only a handful of African countries didn't send their head of state. So it's difficult to escape the conclusion that what we're seeing here is a major geopolitical shift, and one that's happening before our very eyes.
Well, that was Stephen McDonald in Beijing. Well, let's bring in Tony Watima. He's an economist in Nairobi. Thanks for taking time to talk to us. We're talking about $60 billion in loans and aid. But I wonder whether these developing countries can actually make the repayments, given that some of them are actually in danger of defaulting on other loans.
Yeah, that's the biggest question that many people have asked. We talk about quite a number of countries are in economic distress or are heading to economic distress. The 60 billion fund that China is bringing brings another dimension of whether these countries can be sustainable to be able to repay these loans. Now, the biggest question is that China has been promising quite a number of these funds, but in terms of countries meeting those, countries receiving those amounts, there have been quite some red tape in terms of the requirements that you access these loans. So that's another question. Even if it's promised, we are yet to see even the previous funds that countries benefited much out of those loans that were promised. I
wonder, though, then, whether the continent has a clear strategy on how to use these funds for their development.
Not so far. No, there is no plan. Because countries are negotiating bilaterally as individual countries. We don't see that countries negotiating as regional blocs in terms of infrastructure projects that are doing within the region. If countries will negotiate as regional blocs, they will have a better standing in terms of negotiations with China. But we are yet to see that because countries are negotiating as individuals, and it brings another dimension on how cost-effective it is, whether you negotiate as a region or whether you negotiate as individual countries.
All right, Tony, the Chinese president talked about no strings attached. Is there really anything like that when it comes to investment?
That statement is specifically on political interference. And we've seen the Chinese model has been that. There's been little interference, political interference within African countries where they conduct business. Now, that is true because that has been their model. The question is that in terms of political interference, you need democratic accountability, you need democratic stability in order for these countries to prosper, even if they are to pay the loans back. Now, China will at some point have to step in, because we saw this with South Sudan. They were part of the negotiations in terms of the peace treaty. And so it's something that they might postpone for now, but it's something that is dire, that is needed in the country, especially looking at how countries are degenerating in terms of democratic accountability.
All right, very briefly, South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa has just gone back home to find some problem in his own country. The country is, the economy is now in recession. How will they bounce back, do you think? Very briefly.
the technical thing about the recession in South Africa is that agricultural sector hasn't performed as expected. That's the biggest hit for the economy. We can see that it might rebound, but the question is that about South Africa is that the social injustice question about land appropriation laws. It creates an uncertainty within the market that they will have to navigate in terms of boosting investor confidence to South Africa.
All right, Tony Watema in Nairobi, thank you for taking time to talk to us here on Focus on Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Now, an investigation is underway after an explosion at a munitions factory near Cape Town in South Africa, which left 8 people dead. Much of the building was destroyed in the blast that also rocked nearby homes. Well, let's go straight to our correspondent, Nomsa Maseko, who is in Johannesburg. Nomsa, what is the company saying about this explosion?
Well, the company expressed shock and said it was saddened by what has happened. It also says that this is not the first time that such a blast has occurred. In just the last 10 years, it has recorded about 3 incidents, but also says that this one is the most devastating one. It also says it's still investigating the cause of the blast.
Well, there was a government minister who visited the place today. What does the government intend to do now?
Indeed, there were several government ministers who visited the site. They also said that they want to offer and provide support to families of those who lost their relatives. And also they are saying that it could take a while before an investigation is concluded, but we understand that many more other government ministers will come out, to go and visit the site after the Deputy President, David Mabuza, called for this, investigation to be a top priority investigation.
And so how is the community dealing with this tragedy?
It's quite somber, it's quite devastated for such a small community to be experiencing such an incident. In fact, community members went to the factory today to offer support to the relatives of those who lost their loved ones, and also, held some prayer meetings. In fact, there were some 2 stories that came out. One was that of a 21-year-old who died in the blast, who was actually meant to be resigning and start his job as a police officer, and the other who'd been working for the company for the last 21 years, and his wife refuses to accept that her husband has died.
Yeah, quite a tragic story there. Nomsa Maseko, thank you for that update. Thank you. Well, let's now take a look at other stories making the headlines across Africa and the rest of the world. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, the opposition MLC party has warned a court decision to ban its candidate Jean-Pierre Bemba from running in December's elections will drag the country into chaos. Now, Mr. Bemba, a former warlord, was ruled ineligible because of a conviction at the International Criminal Court for alleged bribing witnesses. And the British government has apologized over what it calls the shameful way residents of the disputed Chagos Islands in the Indian Ocean were evicted from the territory about 50 years ago. However, it insisted the matter should not have been referred to the International Court of Justice. Mauritius argues that the islands are an integral to its territory. A former city trader who was jailed after losing $1.8 billion from the Swiss bank UBS has accused the UK authorities of racism after being told he faces deportation. Kweku Adoboli, who was born in Ghana but has lived in the UK since he was 12, was jailed for 7 years. Now, he says peace is the priority, but can Mali's President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta deliver? He made that promise as he was sworn in for a second term just hours after a UN peacekeeper was injured in a rocket attack in the northern town of Menaka. Now, Mr. Keïta won 67% of the vote, a result that the opposition still disputes. So what kind of future lies ahead for Mali? Let's bring in Paul Meli from the Africa program at the Chatham House and, of course, a specialist in the Malian affairs. Paul, 5 years ago, Mr. Boubacar Keïta, he was elected in a landslide majority. And he promised to restore peace, he promised to defeat armed groups, he promised to improve the economy. Did he achieve any of this at all?
He made some progress with all of them. The recovery of the economy in some ways is the least significant in headline terms, but of course affects most ordinary Malians. And you can say that in a very difficult situation, he managed to maintain economic stability, and from, as it were, its indigenous strengths, gold mining, agriculture, the Malian economy grew, and that will support ordinary Malians. But for the really tough agenda, the peace process, he was slow to engage. And the big criticism that's been made of him both by the Malian opposition, but frankly by many international partners and many people in the wider West African region, is that he could have driven the process through with more dynamism. The fact that Mali is still wrestling with terrorism, the fact that there are still problems of instability in the center of the country, critics would say, is partly down to the lack of momentum, if you like, in his leadership.
So would you say then can he categorically say that he's in control of the country, given the large parts in the northern part of Mali that really are not under his control?
Yes, I think he can say that the Malian state is in control of most of the country. Of course, large parts of the far north are just empty desert, and it wouldn't be practical for the government to have what you might call a detailed local presence everywhere. But what's been absent is really a clear strategic vision for how he's going to, as it were, thicken up the state. And it was quite telling at his swearing in today, after he'd been sworn in, taken the oath, the Chief Justice of the Malian Supreme Court basically said, and now your job is to re-establish the presence of the Malian state and its services in all parts of the territory, obviously in all parts where people live. And the really big problem area is the center of the country, where there wasn't violence 5 years ago, but now there's an ongoing intercommunal, partly ethnic, partly jihadism conflict. And there's been one local peace deal this week, but already it's been repudiated. And that's going to be the big challenge. Can he tackle that?
All right, so very quickly, one word. If you were to speak to him, what would you advise him to do? Priority?
Peace in central Mali, and really trying to make that local peace agreement something that can spread out across the centre, because a lot of people live there. It's not like the north, it's quite densely populated, and it really matters in economic terms as well.
All right, Paul Melly, thank you for your thoughts. Thank you.